afternoon, everybody. Please welcome Elise Sargent, who's presenting for us today. Elise is a lecturer here in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice and a member of the GCI. The focus of her work is on police legitimacy and procedural justice. I'm sure we're about to learn some more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. So today I'm going to be talking about an evaluation of the Voice for Values Recruit Training Program, and I'm presenting this research on behalf of myself, obviously, and also my co-authors. So Assistant Commissioner Debbie Platts from the Australian Federal Police, formerly of the QPS, Professor Heather Strang from the University of Cambridge, Dr. Emma Andrews, who is here today, and Professor Lorraine Mazerol from, both of them are from the University of Queensland. I'd also like to make a number of acknowledgements. So this is sort of been a project that's involved many people, both in the running of the program and the evaluation. So I'd like to acknowledge the Queensland Police Service Academy, including Inspector Ian Thompson, who is also here, and many others at the Academy who helped out with this project and put the program together. I'd also like to thank Courage to Care, who ran the program, the University of Cambridge professors Larry Sherman and Dr. Jeffrey Barnes, who helped out with the experimental design, and also to the Queensland Police Service more broadly for providing their support and funding. So Commissioner Ian Stewart, Deputy Commissioner Peter Martin, and Ms. Sandra Smith and her team at the Research and Evaluation Unit. I also need to acknowledge that there was some funding provided for this project from the QPS, but anything that's expressed in this presentation and any errors that are made are my responsibility and not the Queensland Police Service. So essentially today what I want to talk about is results from two studies that have been published based on the evaluation of the Voice for Values program. So I'm going to start by telling you a bit about the Voice for Values program, what it actually is, and then talk about the way that the program was evaluated, so the evaluation design. And then I'm going to break the presentation into two parts, where I'll talk about the methods and results from two papers that have been published. So one which has come out last week in the Cambridge Journal of Evidence-Based Policing, and also some work that we've published in the Journal of Experimental Criminology. And I hadn't presented this work at Griffith before, so I thought it was maybe a nice opportunity to share some of what I've been doing over the past couple of years. So the Voice for Values program is essentially sort of a values or cultural education program that was put together and run by the Queensland Police Service Training Academy. And it had a number of aims, but perhaps two of the key aims of the program were really to think about encouraging or fostering positive attitudes toward diversity in the workplace. So if you think about some of the criticisms of police culture that have been raised in the literature over the past 30 years, there's this idea that perhaps tolerance towards diversity or attitudes toward diversity could be encouraged or improved. And then the second aim of the program was really about encouraging police recruits to intervene in workplace harassment incidents. And again, this was really focused around tolerance for diversity, so workplace harassment around ethnicity, race and gender. The core concept of the program sounds a little bit out there, but I hope I can demonstrate how it actually works. So essentially what the core concept is that we draw on examples from the Holocaust to demonstrate why it's important to intervene in wrong behaviours. So we all know about the Holocaust, and we can all kind of perhaps relate to this idea of people not standing up and doing something in the face of wrong behaviours, and then we see that things kind of get out of control. So this is a unique program, but it's also based on some other programs that have also drawn on this concept. So the Courage to Care program uses these examples from the Holocaust to encourage children to intervene in schoolyard bullying, and also the Law Enforcement and Society program, which has a similar premise to the program I'm talking about today. So the program was essentially delivered as a workshop, and it contained about 4 components. So first of all, we have a DVD that was created by the Training Academy, and it depicted poor police behaviours in the policing workplace. And as I mentioned, this is specifically around issues to do with racism and sexism. Then we had an audiovisual history of the role of the police in World War II and the Holocaust. So thinking about how police can intervene to encourage positive behaviours and perhaps also do the wrong thing. And then perhaps the core component of this program is hearing from a Holocaust death camp survivor. And the focus of the story was really around thinking about how that person survived and got out of that situation and how other people helped and stood up against wrong behaviours. So it's all about upstanding. And then the last part of the workshop that really kind of brings the presentation and the workshop together was about getting the recruits to think about how they could upstand in the face of wrong behaviours. So that was a facilitated workshop discussion at the end. So the Queensland Police Service had developed this program and they were really interested to see whether or not it worked. So they wanted to examine whether or not the program was effective at changing some of the attitudes or developing this kind of tolerance toward diversity. So the Queensland Police Service approached researchers at the University of Queensland, including myself, Lorraine Mazerol and Emma Antrobus. They approached us and asked us to help with the evaluation of the program. So the experimental design, so it was run as an experiment, I'll talk a bit more about that, was developed by the QPS in consultation with the University of Cambridge and ourselves. And then we were really in charge of the survey evaluation. So it was evaluated using a survey instrument, and that was administered by the University of Queensland. So I previously was at the University of Queensland. So the design of the evaluation was a randomised controlled trial. So it was an experimental design, and it involved recruits who came into the academy between May and August in 2015. So the experiment involved 260 police recruits, and they were randomly assigned to either the experimental condition, which was the Voice for Values training program, or a control condition, which was just sort of business as usual training. So then they were randomly assigned upon entry into the academy. The Voice Values training program was delivered to the experimental group, and the training was conducted out at the Oxley Academy. The data collection method, as I mentioned, was a survey design. So it was a quantitative survey, and it was administered online using the Qualtrics platform. We have 6 data points, so we have pre and post-test surveys, and then we had follow-ups at 6 weeks, 12 weeks, 6 months, and 1 year. But in the current presentation, I'm just going to focus on up to 6 weeks. And we used a unique identifier to match over time. So the surveys were anonymous, but we used a unique identifier to match over time. One of the reasons I'm focusing on just the first 6 weeks is partly because we started to work on these projects quite early on, but also because we've had, as you can imagine, quite a drop in the sample over the longitudinal period, and also lots of problems with the unique identifiers. So even though the recruits were given instructions about how to create those, some of them didn't fill it in or did it wrong. So we've had a bit of trouble matching up over time, but hopefully we can sort that out. For the pre, post and 6-week follow-up, we had quite a high response rate for the survey. The reason for this is that the survey was completed at the academy, so recruits completed them in computer labs, and they had nothing else to do. So you can imagine them sitting there, nothing else to do, they fill out the survey. But it was voluntary. So that's a bit about sort of a very brief overview of what the program involved and also the evaluation. And now I'm going to talk really specifically to the methods and analyses and the results of these 2 separate studies. So the first study is really about looking at the evaluation of the program, so thinking about whether or not the program achieved what they wanted to achieve. And then the second study is taking a bit more of an academic tilt on the data. So we're looking at perhaps a research question that we're quite interested in around procedural justice. So I mentioned the aims of the program. So one of these aims was to really look at whether the Voice for Values program actually did change this idea of tolerance toward diversity in the police workplace. And specifically this was around sexism and racism. So the program was geared to try and combat those behaviours, so they wanted to see whether or not that program would actually lead to increased tolerance of diversity. And then there were a number of other outcomes, but this is going to be examined in forthcoming papers, and I'll talk a bit about that at the end of the presentation. So I've got the survey measures here that we use to examine tolerance towards diversity. I've got a number of different measures. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. But essentially, one of the measures we looked at was this idea of whether or not recruits could recognise that particular behaviours were acceptable or not acceptable in the workplace. And these were really related back to the video that police had seen in the workshop. We also had more general measures that were drawn from social psychological literature around attitudes toward prejudice or prejudice attitudes, and then attitudes towards equality. So this idea that all people should be treated equally. So they were quite broad measures. And then this last measure was really speaking to this issue of tolerance of diversity in the workplace. So the idea of working with people from different backgrounds and tolerance of a diverse work group. The analysis that we used in this paper was a very simple analysis. So we looked at an independent samples t-test, and these tests were just essentially used to look at the difference between the experimental and the control groups. We've also replicated some of these analyses using a repeated measures design, and we find very similar results, but this was the analysis that was used in the paper. So I'm just going to present pre-test, post-test and the 6-week follow-up, and just point out some things to note. So in the pre-test, so we've got a number of measures that are tapping into these ideas around tolerance for diversity. And we see that at the pre-condition, so before the treatment was delivered, before the program was delivered, there aren't any significant differences between the groups, which is good. That's what we would expect. And then in the post-test, so this survey was conducted immediately after the workshop was run, we see that there's a significant difference between tolerance of diversity in the workplace between the two groups. So those who had completed the Voice for Values training program were more tolerant toward diversity than those of the control group. But unfortunately, we don't find significant results for the other measures that we were looking at. And then at the 6-week follow-up, so this is 6 weeks after the program was delivered, again we see this significant difference between the experimental and control groups for tolerance toward diversity. And we also see a significant difference emerging for this more general perception of equality. So this idea that all people should be treated equal. And again, we're seeing that the Voice for Values group, the ones who had completed the program, have more positive perceptions of equality, or they're more likely to think people should be equal. So I've just provided some graphs to kind of demonstrate those results and also to flesh them out a little bit further. So you can see, first of all, for the equality measure, the scale is from 1 to 7 and the change is very small, so the difference is very small. So even though we're seeing a significant difference, it's not a huge difference. It's not like the recruits have, in the control group, have appalling attitudes toward equality, for example. They're still sitting quite high up in the scale and there's not that much of a difference between them. When we look at tolerance of diversity in the workplace, we see kind of an interesting pattern emerging. So we see that there's a significant difference, again, at that immediate follow-up and then at the 6-week follow-up. But we see that for those who completed the Voice for Values program, the results are remaining relatively stable. And for the control group, we're seeing that the results are on the decline. So this is suggesting that over time, recruits are developing less tolerant attitudes toward diversity, but that the Voice for Values program is potentially providing some sort of a buffer to that. But again, you know, it's not a massive change on the scale. So what we're seeing from these results is that the Voice for Values program did seem to have a positive influence, but it wasn't increasing attitudes. It wasn't making recruits more positive towards or more tolerant towards diversity as we might have hoped. On the other hand, the standard recruit training experience seemed to be having a negative impact on tolerance toward diversity over time. And as I mentioned, we sort of think that the Voice for Values program is kind of having a buffering effect over these declining attitudes over time. So this, as I mentioned, is quite a simplistic analysis. So the next steps are really to think about the extent of this decline over time. And we're hoping that once we can pull together all of these waves of the survey, we can look at how significant this decline is over time. And we can also look at recruits as they're leaving the recruit training program and going out into the workplace. The other thing that we'd like to look at is what's actually causing this decline in attitudes. So is it maybe some kind of a peer culture that's developing among the recruits that's leading to this to happen? Or is it perhaps caused by some kind of external factors? Like, is there something about how police go into the academy? Are they treated differently by people outside of the academy? Is this then changing their views? So perhaps people in the academy are having negative experiences, perhaps with people outside of the academy. And our hope is perhaps to conduct some further research with the QPS to really look at why this is happening. And then, as I mentioned, we've got some other measures that we haven't yet sort of published on, and one of them that's of particular interest to us is this idea of recruits actually being more willing to intervene in the workplace in racism and sexism. And what we find from our preliminary results is that it seems to be more of a positive change here. So rather than attitudes remaining stable over time, we see that there's an increase in the willingness of recruits to intervene in racism and sexism in the workplace, but also that these attitudes then begin to decline over time. So the next study, as I mentioned, is really taking a bit more of a sort of an academic kind of research question around some of the data that we had collected. And you'll know, all of you will know that procedural justice is one of my key areas of interest. So this was the kind of tilt that we took on the data. So we know that procedural justice is found to be really key for promoting compliance. So this is what procedural justice is kind of known for. When authorities treat people with procedural justice or with fairness, they're more likely to comply with those authorities or cooperate with them. And this finding is often discussed, particularly around some of the research that we do at Griffith in regard to a police-citizen interaction. So citizens are more likely to comply with the police when police treat them fairly. But in the literature, this is examined across a really wide range of contexts. So we see that procedural justice is examined in the organisational context. So particularly thinking about how people in organisations might comply with their supervisors, so with their boss, and also with rules and policies in their organisation. So there are some concerns about procedural justice that haven't quite been examined a great deal. So there are some people who are quite critical, some academics who are quite critical of the procedural justice approach. And some of the concerns that have been raised have been pitched around this kind of double-edged sword idea of procedural justice. And this double-edged sword kind of questions the idea that compliance is always a good thing. So is it always a good thing to comply with authorities all the time? If we think about that Holocaust kind of example, we could talk about how that's not always a good thing. The other thing that has been raised in this literature is this idea of coercing compliance. So procedural justice is kind of being pitched as this tool that can make people comply. And procedural justice is kind of meant to be all about fairness and treating people well. And the idea that it might be used as sort of a manipulative tool to get people to comply has been questioned. So is the idea of coercing compliance out of people potentially a bad thing? So these are some of the, theoretical ideas that are being kind of kicked around in the literature. And there hasn't been a lot that's kind of looked at this question. So we thought that one thing that we could do with this data, we've got a program that's encouraging police to kind of stand up and do the right thing, and perhaps even go against what their supervisors are telling them. So some of the examples in the training are around sort of, intervening. You might be intervening and jobbing on your supervisor, for example, for being racist or sexist. So we thought that we would look at this kind of question using this data. And we know that compliance is really important in policing. So in the police organisation, police obviously need to follow the law. There's also lots of rules and there's a hierarchy. So police are generally obeying the instructions of their supervisors. But we think that kind of an unthinking or blind compliance, so this idea that you always comply with your supervisor no matter what, could actually be a bad thing. So this feeds into this double-edged sword idea. And it could potentially lead to like a negative sort of police culture. So if your supervisor is doing the wrong thing and then they get you to comply with them, they might be making you do the wrong thing. So we're kind of questioning this idea of whether unthinking or blind compliance could actually be a bad thing. So as I mentioned, one of the goals of the program was really to encourage recruits to stand up against, intervene in and report against racist and sexist behaviour in the policing organisation. So we expected that this program would actually encourage recruits to be more cautious about blindly obeying orders. So it's encouraging them to think about what they're doing in terms of complying with orders. So in this study, we tested the relationship between supervisory procedural justice and compliance, but we looked at a moderating effect of the Voice for Values program. So looking at whether the Voice for Values program could mitigate perhaps a potential negative effect on this kind of unthinking compliance. So the survey measures we used here, pretty simple. So we looked at supervisory procedural justice, and then we looked at two types of compliance. So we had soft compliance, which is just sort of regular compliance, just the willingness to comply and adhere to instructions and procedures. And then hard compliance is about doing that, but irrespective of what you're being asked to do. So I'm going to obey my supervisor regardless of what they ask me to do. So these are the measures that we used in the survey. So again, I'll just go through these quite quickly. So this is all about supervisors treating their subordinates with fairness and respect, etc. And then hard compliance, an example is I follow my supervisor's instructions even when I think they are wrong. So this is when we're getting at this kind of unthinking compliance. I'm just going to do whatever they say even if it's the wrong thing to do. And then soft compliance is just I'm going to do what they say. So in our analyses, again, quite a simple analysis. We just looked at the pre-post data this time, and we compared the experimental or the treatment group, which was the recruits who went through the Voice for Values program, and the control group. And we ran a moderated regression analysis. And so just a couple of things to point out here. So we can see with this result here, the experimental condition. So if recruits have participated in the Voice for Values program, it meant they were less likely to indicate that they would hard comply. And this is what we would expect. So they're less likely to say, I'm going to comply with my supervisor no matter what, if their orders are wrong, etc. Because the program was encouraging them to upstand. But this wasn't the same for soft compliance, so it didn't have an effect on that. And then we also find that the interaction effects here and here were significant for both of the groups. And I've got graphs of those. For both of the outcomes. So for soft compliance and for hard compliance, the moderating effect was significant, so we've graphed both of those. We don't see on the graph a lot of a difference for for soft compliance, but essentially what these graphs show is that procedural justice is less effective at predicting compliance for those who have completed the training. So the training is getting people to think more about whether or not they're going to comply, and it's mitigating any kind of manipulative effect that procedural justice might have. And we can see, as we would expect, that this result is quite strong for hard compliance. So for the treatment group, so those who had undertaken the Voice for Values program, they were less susceptible to being manipulated by procedural justice into hard complying. So the key findings, those in the Voice for Values experimental condition were less likely to hard comply with their supervisors. The Voice for Values program moderated the effect of supervisory procedural justice on compliance, and this was particularly salient for hard compliance. So it's suggesting that there's some kind of mitigating effect of the training on this relationship between procedural justice and compliance. And essentially what we think this means is that there's sort of an increased level of scrutiny by police recruits about the orders that they're receiving. So they're thinking a bit more about what their supervisors are asking them to do. So interpreting these results, well, obviously compliance with supervisors is beneficial for organisations. So we're not suggesting that compliance with supervisors should go out the window. It's obviously very beneficial and it's needed, particularly in organisations like the police where, you know, an order could mean, you know, or obeying an order could mean sort of life and death situation. However, we're sort of questioning the idea of unthinking or blind compliance, and we're saying that, you know, this could have a potential downside, which could be misconduct. There's also been this current push around procedural justice. So I'm sure a lot of you will be familiar with, there's been this sort of exponential growth in procedural justice research. Everyone's gone crazy for it. I love it, I do research on it, but it's just important to be critical. So let's think about it critically. Does it, you know, is it always going to lead to a positive outcome? And what our studies suggest is that cultural training may actually be used to help avoid unthinking compliance. So questioning this idea of whether unthinking compliance is a good idea, and reduce any kind of manipulative effect of procedural justice on unthinking compliance in particular, as well as to encourage upstanding in the face of wrong behaviours. So that's all I have put together for today. I like to keep it short and not drone on for too long. So references, these results are published, as I mentioned, in the first two papers and also in Debbie's thesis. So the first paper is an open access and Debbie's thesis is as well. If you want full versions of the papers, obviously I can give them to you. And that's it. Thank you for coming and thank you for your attention.